Okay, today we're going to cover epithelia tissue. And as I mentioned, we're going to encounter epithelial tissue as well as connective tissue in all our systems to some degree. So remember, these main tissue types come from those three primary germ layers: muscle and connective tissue coming from the mesoderm, nervous tissue coming from the ectoderm, and then we're going to find epithelial derived from all three layers. So that makes sense since it's found all over the body. And the main structure of epithelial is that it is tightly bound sheets of cells. And so that sheet comprises an uninterrupted layer of cells. And just a word on how my slides are going to look. If you see this S in parentheses when I'm introducing a cell, tissue, or organ, that means what is the structure? What does it look like? How is it arranged or organized? So you're going to find these sheets of cells covering exposed body surfaces. In fact, the word epithelium means covering in some language. And you'll find epithelial sheets lining internal cavities and passageways. So when you see that L in parentheses, that means the location. That is, where do we find the cell, tissue, structure, or organ? So the C and L there means covering and lining. And it's the simplest way to remember where you'd find epithelia. And it's also very close to what its function is, which we'll talk about in a second. So as far as its covering, the epidermis, or as the epithelial lining of our skin, lies between the inside and outside of the body. The ventral body cavity also has an epithelial layer marking the boundary between the cavity and the body wall. So as you'll see, the epithelial layer of your skin, for example, is a particular type of epithelial that will determine what gets inside the body. So that's against the external environment, but there's also a giant tube going through your body from the mouth to the anus, and in the space within that hollow tube is considered outside of your body. So that when you eat or drink something, stuff can go through that entire system without technically being in your body, kind of like a corn kernel passes through. That whole gut tube is lined with different types of epithelia, and the same is going to go for your respiratory tract. If all things are working correctly, the only way to get into the body from that gut tube is going to be by passing through the cell membrane of those epithelial cells. In a similar way, epithelial cells are lining the inside of those tubes running through your body that carry blood. And the blood is actually going to stay inside that tube because of that lining, and filtrate will be allowed to exit that tube based on the particular epithelial structure. We'll talk more about the endothelia, the lining of the blood vessels, when we talk about the cardiovascular system. So that's the lining. The word covering is going to reference its location, but also implies a function. So when we specifically talk about what that covering does, you're talking about function. That is, what does this tightly bound sheet of cells that cover us do? Why do we need that? Since the epithelial tissue forms a boundary between the human body and its external and internal environments, its function reflects this interface. So we'll talk about 4 functions that you should know here. And with a little stretching, I could make them all start with the letter P. So the letter F there, parentheses, will refer to function from now on. So now you have structure, location, and function. You're going to see in my slides quite a bit for a simple description of whatever we're talking about. Let's go into a little more detail about what each of these refers to. What does protection mean? The epithelial boundary can serve a protective function, in particular when it's a thick epithelial lining, such as in your skin, which protects the underlying tissue that are subject to abrasion and invasion. Abrasion refers to scraping or rubbing away or wearing away, whereas invasion could refer to invading pathogens. More on that when we get to the skin. Because your skin also provides protection in that it controls what gets into the body from the outside. Water, chemicals, UV light, and this is another major function which really may be the most general function of epithelia, that is permeability. So going back to that gut tube, which is lined with epithelial cells, and the tube is going to contain all the food and drink you consumed, and the function of much of that digestive tract is to get those digested nutrients into the body. But it has to do that while making sure other stuff doesn't get in, like the bacteria that co-inhabit your intestinal tract. So in this epithelial sheet, it's very hard to penetrate because of how tight the cells are connected together. So most things are not getting in between epithelial cells. Generally, if we let stuff in our body, it's going to go through the cell itself, not between them. And just to go back to some basics here, the cell membrane is what is referred to as being selectively permeable, so that a passage of substance is through the cell membrane in a particular way based on several factors we're not going to discuss here. But the idea of stuff moving through these cell membranes on one side of the cell and then passing through the cell membrane on the other side of the cell into the body is called absorption. And so many epithelial cells are going to be specialized for this absorption. Other cells are going to be specialized to secrete stuff, that is, stuff going out of the body passing through these cells. So again, back to basic cell biology and the process of secretion, where certain types of epithelia are going to transform substances from the body and then discharge it into some kind of space, like a lumen or a duct. This function of producing secretions is distinct from the functions related to covering and lining, and is the domain of glandular epithelial tissue, which we'll talk about later. And you'll see then how this glandular epithelium fits in with the general roles of epithelia. So the last function of epithelial is again related to the interface with the environment, and that is to provide sensation. In your skin, for example, the epithelial lining is the location of free nerve endings that can detect things like noxious stimuli or temperature or other information about possible dangers in the immediate environment. Internally, an example is in your nasal cavity, which is full of air that you breathe, and along with that, all the odorants in the air. And the epithelial lining of the nasal cavity is embedded with odorant receptors to give you the sense of smell. The back of your eyeball is also lined with a neuroepithelial containing specialized cells which are going to detect light waves. So those are your 4 functions of the epithelial, reflecting the fact that it forms a boundary between the body and its external and the internal environments. Note that these are general functions of epithelia, and certain types of epithelia will be involved in one or more of these to a greater or less degree. And so the next thing we want to talk about is what are the properties of epithelial tissue that define it and make it a good covering lining so it can carry out those functions. So we talk about the characteristics or organization or properties of epithelial tissue in general, that is, what makes it an epithelial tissue and not another type of tissue, in particular connective tissue, which, as we'll see, in many ways are opposite to epithelial tissue when we look at its characteristics. Useful to compare the two. So let's go over these characteristics or properties in a little more detail. This first one here is key to the structure of epithelia. That is, epithelia comprises an uninterrupted layer or sheet of cells. This means when anytime you look at an epithelial sample, all you should see is cells with little or no space in between them. And even when an epithelial surface seems to be penetrated by a hole such as this pore of a gland, that hole is really just an invagination of the epithelial. The surface still comprises an uninterrupted layer of cells. The cells all tightly stuck together, and I want to go through a quick review on 3 different ways in which the cells are connected. That is, what are the intercellular devices that provide the structural integrity of the epithelia? The 3 which I'm going to briefly go over are anchoring junctions, tight junctions, and gap junctions. The anchoring junctions, which you'll also see referred to as desmosomes or hemidesmosomes, are the main structures which provide a mechanical attachment between the cells within an epithelia. These are proteins which are attached to the cell's cytoskeleton on the inside, pass through the cell membrane, and attach to other proteins on the adjacent cell. These type of junctions also attach the epithelial cells to an underlying scaffolding, which I'll discuss in a minute. And when you look at the layers of the skin, we're going to see the epithelial, within the epithelial, these little spiny structures that are actually desmosomes or anchoring junctions, which are going to provide the structural integrity for the epithelial of your skin. The next type of junctions are called tight junctions, and you're going to find those near what's called the free surface of a cell, that is the side facing the environment or lumen, and functionally is to prevent things from going in between the cells to get in the body. So they block diffusion that form a seal or gasket around close to that free surface and helps ensure adequate separation between the different fluid compartments on either side of the boundary. This last type of junction does not hold the cells together, but rather permits communication between the adjacent joined cells. These are channels which are going to permit the free diffusion of things like ions and small molecules and fluid to be shared between the cells. So there are the three mechanisms of cell adhesion, that is how cells are stuck together and how they contribute to the cellularity. Note that in thicker layers of epithelia, those type of junctions would occur all around the cells to connect with each cell with its all the surrounding neighbors. The next two characteristics, we'll talk about them together, that is the polarity and the basement membrane. The term polarity means there's a difference between one side of the cell and the other. All epithelial have a free apical surface, which abuts the open space of a cavity, tubule, gland, or hollow organ, and a basal surface which lies on a thin supporting sheet called the basement membrane. The polarity will also refer to the distribution of organelles within the cell. That is, you'll often see the nuclei and mitochondria near the basal surface, whereas the transport vesicles and Golgi apparatus might be close to the apical surface, so those vesicles can be released into the external environment. So that basal surface of the cell is attached to a particular structure common to all epithelia called the basement membrane, which forms the boundary between epithelial cells and the underlying connective tissue. So structurally, it's a specialized extracellular matrix, ECM, with a distinct sheet-like arrangement, and there are sublayers which I do not require you to know, but you may see references to. So the basement membrane provides a scaffolding in which to secure the epithelial cells and also can act as a filtration barrier, helping control what goes in or out of those cells. Okay, the last two common properties of epithelia are avascularity and regeneration. So I mentioned before that an epithelial lining may have nerve endings passing through them. However, they don't have any kind of blood vessels going through that epithelial sheet. So epithelia is referred to as avascular. It gets its oxygen and nutrients from the capillaries embedded within the connective tissue that it is always associated with. Functionally, this makes sense in terms of its role in controlling permeability, because the epithelial layer needs to control what gets inside those blood vessels, because once it gets inside your blood vessel, it'll have access to the entire body. So the last property we're going to talk about here is the ability of the epithelial layer to replace itself constantly. This is referred to as its regenerative capacity. Some epithelia are exposed to friction and their surface cells rub off. Others are destroyed by hostile substances in the external environment. So epithelial cells take a lot of abuse in many of their locations. But they're constantly replacing themselves to repair the damage. So in any epithelial layer, you're going to find a subpopulation of stem cells that are actively dividing and contributing to the layer, and another population that is constantly being shed off. The epithelia of your skin, for instance, replaces itself every month or so, and much of your poop consists of your intestinal lining cells that you've been shed off. As you get older, this replacement process starts to generally slow down, and this is a big problem with wound repair and general deterioration. So those are the characteristics that are common to all epithelial cells and the properties that make them epithelial as opposed to connective tissue. In the next part, we're going to look at and differentiate between different types of epithelia. So we'll see you then. Bye.